Welcome back to Literature of the Ancient Near East. I'm Dr. Justin Singleton. This is the very last of the introductory lectures, and after this, you'll have a lecture on Mesopotamian literature specifically, followed by lots of Mesopotamian literature reading. In this lecture, we'll be discussing analytical methods, beginning with an analysis of connotative works, including a story's plot, themes, setting, imagery, character, style, and structure. After that, there'll be a short section on understanding denotative works, followed by the models of interpretation. So, let's jump into it. The analysis of ancient literature is no different than the analysis of any literature, except that the reader is likely not reading in the original language. Having accepted the translation of literature in question, the reader must then turn to a number of heuristic tools at his or her disposal in order to better understand the text. And utilizing these tools, the scholar begins with his or her own literary theories. But in the end, these theories are understood to contain four characteristics. First, the theory must be interdisciplinary. That is to say that the analysis of the text must seek help from multiple fields, not just the field of literary science. Now, within an understanding of ancient Near Eastern literature, the obvious additional fields include history, linguistics, archaeology, anthropology, biblical studies, and more. Beyond these obvious disciplines, the complex examination of ancient literature must also include the fields of both cognitive and social psychology, psycholinguistics, text and social linguistics, and pragmatics. Second, the theory must be analytical and speculative. Here, the theory must seek to work out what's involved in the differing aspects of the composition. Now, rather than a simple set of skills, this means that the analysis itself is a frame of mind whereby the scholar attempts to understand something that's not yet understood, as opposed to simply making a list of answers already comprehended. Anyone can read a piece of ancient literature and do nothing more than gloss the basic truths. The true scholar is the one who dives deeper into the text in order to find questions where it seemed at first none had existed. Third, the theory must include a critique of common sense. When one reads ancient literature, one tends to make assumptions about that literature based on one's preconceived notions. These may stem from an evolutionary way of thinking about the writers or the original audience, assuming that they are lesser evolved or less intelligent. Conversely, these may stem from the idea that the worldview of the authors or target audience members mimics our own understanding of how the world functions. In reality, these common sense notions are often historical constructions that modern man has placed upon the ancient author. It is therefore vital that the scholar moves beyond the simple common sense understanding of modern man in order to discern what the original author intended the original audience to understand. Fourth, finally, the theory must be reflexive. Rather than this indicating that literary theories allow for any and all possible meanings, a reflexive approach allows the scholar to bring his or her own background into the study at hand. This type of intersectional approach legitimizes perceptions that many scholars may be completely lacking, such as approaching the object to be analyzed from the perspective of a low-class inner city dweller, that is, a street kid, or an agrarian pastoralist, that is, a farm kid. From my own perspective, intersectional approaches to my reading integrates war and psychological trauma into understanding ancient Near Eastern texts, a perspective that is a minority to many readers. Because individual backgrounds are so varied, each individual reader likely holds a new and different perspective upon the text than any other, and therefore these perspectives should be celebrated. The analysis of literature requires that the scholar break down that literature in order to better understand how it's been constructed, discovering the work's components, how those components function, and finally, how they work together. Within connotative works, these components include plot, theme, setting, imagery, characterization, style, and structure. But all of this within the social, cultural, political, and even historical contexts. Within denotative works, texts that may be considered rather dry as they deal with facts as compared to purely fictional works, the elements may be a bit different. Here, a plot is often altogether missing, as very often denotative works don't tell a story per se. Instead, elements of these texts include facts and often opinions. As noted before, some works within ancient Near Eastern texts connote or imply secondary associations of differing natures. These may be intellectual, cultural, or sensory associations. As such, the Bellatron nature of these texts allow, although not directly, for a comparison to works of fiction in the modern sense. These connotative works often include aspects of fictional narrative. Ancient Near Eastern myths, epics, and tales very often carry a plot along with recognizable plot devices. Don't worry, you don't need to pause and read all that. That's just a bunch of big long list of plot devices. The same could be said of hymns, wisdom literature, and poetry. By plot, it's understood as the overarching storyline that guides the story through its main points. It's the dynamic whole of the story to which all the pieces relate. 19th century German novelist Gustav Freytag discovered what he believed to be a typical pattern in plot development throughout Shakespearean and Greek dramas. Known as the Freytag Pyramid, the pattern is often found in most literature of fiction or those using fictional devices. Used as a map of the storyline, the pyramid describes the 5-stage process of dramatic structure, namely exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. The exposition lays out the background of the story, introducing characters and sometimes providing a narrative hook, a device used to grab the attention of the reader. By way of example, within the Epic of Gilgamesh, the exposition is seen in the introduction of Gilgamesh, particularly in his oppression of his people. Here, Gilgamesh is established as a bad king who takes what he wants whenever he wants. The rising action of the story is often initiated by an inciting incident, an event that begins the upward movement of the story. Within the Epic of Gilgamesh, this could perhaps be understood as the creation of the monster Enkidu in order to balance the lifestyle of Gilgamesh. From the point of his creation, a series of events occur, introducing tension to the storyline, which is itself the rising action. These events include the taming of Enkidu, Enkidu's challenge of Gilgamesh, and their ensuing battle that leads to the unending friendship, the pair's killing spree, their punishment, and then Gilgamesh mourning the loss of his friend. The climax of the story, that turning point where the conflict has reached its peak and the outcome has been decided, occurs when Gilgamesh finds his ancestor Utnapishtim and learns the secret of immortality. Within the story, it's at this point that the fate of Gilgamesh is changed irrevocably. After losing his best friend, he learns that there's a way that he may live forever. But as one may expect, this will never occur. As a result of the climax, certain events occur. This is referred to as the falling action. Within Gilgamesh, these are seen in the king's failures to keep the key to immortality. The final steps in the map of Freytag's dramatic pyramid include the resolution, that event that settles the key issues of the story, and the denouement, the tying up of loose ends. Within the Epic of Gilgamesh, this clean ending comes in the form of Gilgamesh realizing that he will not live forever, but will instead die knowing that at least his story will be told for generations, which it actually is. So, beyond the plot, a story may have multiple themes. These may include several recurring elements of the subject matter indirectly expressed through the repetition of certain images, symbols, or events. In practically all subjects, repetition shows emphasis, and that emphasis carries meaning. Thus, the theme or themes of a story express universal ideas that the story itself conveys. Within the Epic of Gilgamesh, these themes may include balance and order, the motivating force of love, the inevitability of death, and perhaps the fine line between heroism and hubris. To the first, the unrivaled power of Gilgamesh as he preys upon his own citizens becomes balanced when the gods demand the creation of Enkidu, who is Gilgamesh's other half. Now, without first understanding the setting of a story, one cannot truly understand the story. The setting then is the environment in which the story takes place, including time, place, and culture. In order to comprehend the setting of a story, it's important to ask certain questions, such as those concerning when and where the action takes place, what the relationship is between the setting and the mood, and how the setting creates the mood of the story. Beyond the simple historical setting is the social, cultural, and even political setting of the story. Concerning the Epic of Gilgamesh, one may look to both the historical setting of the real Gilgamesh, who lived around 2600 BC, and to the historical context of the final version of the story, which dates from 6th to 2nd centuries BC. It's important to realize that both the original story and the reimagined story meant something to the people of that time. Otherwise, why even record the epic? Concerning the original Gilgamesh, the historical setting is that of the early dynastic period of Mesopotamia, a time when urban centers were first being established as city-states, and about 70% of all the people lived in those cities. This social context reveals the impotence of the inhabitants of Uruk, people who could not simply pack up and leave for better lands. And the Sumerian setting reveals much about the beliefs at that time, beliefs involving order within the supernatural and therefore natural realm. Politically, Uruk stood as the center of culture and commercialism. And these settings carry over into the Neo-Babylonian Empire, particularly the themes of order and balance in the world. Another aspect of the connotative works is the use of imagery within the text. This can be described as the sensuous effects of language, including such things as striking language, metaphor, symbol, and so forth. In this sense, words are utilized in order to create sensory experiences. In other words, imagery within a text is the idea of painting with words. Ancient Near Eastern texts are very often full of literary images. Perhaps the most often used image in ancient Near Eastern texts is that of the bull. The bull was a figure of power, protection, and perhaps most importantly, fertility. Because of this, the bull was often associated with manliness and the ability to rule. Thus, in the first tablet of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king is said to be a goring wild bull. This bull imagery is supplemented by the action of goring, an action noted in several ancient Near Eastern law codes with penalties to the owner of the animal. The goring nature of Gilgamesh relates not only to his power and manliness, but to his instability as a man and as a ruler. Interestingly, the power and manliness of Gilgamesh was made use of when a deity released the bull of heaven upon Uruk, the bull devouring pastures and drinking up the river. Gilgamesh, with his friend Enkidu, was able to defeat the bull and end the drought. Somewhat similar to imagery, the concept of characterization is often that of the humanizing of personalities within the text. This tool is utilized in order to make the character more real to the reader. In many respects, this humanizing process creates sympathy for the character in order not only to carry the plot, but to allow the reader to reflect personally upon the text. This tool is used within Gilgamesh in different ways. First, Gilgamesh is humanized negatively, showing the aspects of bad leadership. Ultimately, though, the characterization of Gilgamesh leads the reader to pity the hero, who's not only lost his friend, but the object that could give him immortal life. This process is understood in the broader picture to teach the readers that there must be a balance and order within the world, and that no man can avoid fate. Rather than style meaning merely a sort of literary decoration of the text, a text style should be understood as the author's choice to use a specific word, phrase, or manner of writing in order to convey a thought. In this way, the author selects, arranges, and expresses particularly what that author wishes to say. Because of these purposes, artistic styles can be understood as certain characteristics of an author, a genre, a period of time, or a specific kind of rhetoric. In some instances, the author may choose approaches akin to logical exercises, or even emotional approaches to the narrative, all depending upon the purpose of the author. The writing style of the Epic of Gilgamesh has been understood to be poetic and repetitive, yet simple. The poetic style of the story, with its vivid imagery and rhetorical devices, enhances the impression that the story sets upon the reader. The simplicity of the story can be partially explained by the writing process itself, being a rather restricted form of writing known as cuneiform, the earliest versions of which were merely business related. Old Assyrian cuneiform text often used only between 150 and 200 cuneiform signs, but these became more complicated as time went on. Even with the complexity of later cuneiform scripts, the text simply tells the story as it occurs without complex metaphors. With that said, it's still a poem which originally, in the standard Babylonian Epic of Gilgamesh, likely consisted of around 3,600 lines of poetry over 11 or 12 tablets. An example of stylistic use of this poetry can be seen in the contrast between orderly poetic form and the breakdown of that form. For instance, in an attempt to show the distress of the king, the author moves from order and poetic calm to a rush of words when he writes the following: Day and night I wept over him. I did not give him up for burial, saying, my friend perhaps will rise up to meet me at my cry. 7 days and 7 nights until a worm dropped out at me from his nose. The final element to be mentioned is the structure of the story. By structure, it's meant the relationships between the various parts of the text to each other and how those relationships are achieved. Concisely, this is how a story is told. The idea moves beyond the mechanical organization of the story into the subjective world of interpretation, identifying symmetries, repetitions, progressions, and balances. In this regard, the structure of the Epic of Gilgamesh includes parallel episodes, such as Utnapishtim surviving the Great Flood and Gilgamesh's search for eternal life. These parallels add a depth to the recurring motif of the mortality of man. Additionally, the episodic nature of the embedded stories slowly build upon each other to create a final moral in the work, a moral that may reflect the power of the gods and the acknowledgement that things happen for a reason. While connotative works often follow a plot, add characterization, and include other aspects of fictional writing, as noted before, denotative works require only two elements: facts and opinions. While some may argue that these texts are not actually literary, as they lack imagination, it can be argued that these denotative works in the ancient Near East almost always include the imagination. Although presented as factual, this is not to say that these works should be understood as outright factual accounts. On the one hand, the author may be working through hearsay, not being present at the event. On the other, the author may be making a completely fabricated tale, but is portraying it as facts. Beyond these, there are a number of reasons the works can't be understood as factual, including poor memory, eyewitness angles, and so forth. Instead, denotative works should be understood as portrayals of facts. These types of works also very often include the opinions of the authors. Similar to modern-day editorials or movie reviews, some denotative works are merely a matter of authorial opinion or taste. As these works are portrayed as reality, authorial opinion can sometimes be confused as facts rather than the subjectivity of the author. Now, moving on. Of the many differing models of interpretation, two stand out the most when referencing ancient Near Eastern texts: the historical grammatical method and the historical critical method. At times, the standard modes of literary criticism can't be applied, particularly as aspects such as authorship, genre, readership, and even purpose can be difficult to ascertain. The modern reader is, after all, very far removed from the original audience and context. Because of this, the reader must focus attention to several points of interest. First, denotative communication is a method that falls between both reality and fiction. Second, while the text may not be exactly true, they still reflect the society. Finally, the readers lacking an extra linguistic knowledge of an ancient people's value system may lead to problems in comprehension. As such, the reader must use caution when approaching the text. Reading into the text one's own views and experiences, as useful as they can be, in order to seek confirmation of those views and experiences, invalidates the literary analysis. Because of these, the following models of interpretation are offered as heuristic tools for the reader to employ. The historical critical method deals particularly as a critique of the formation of the text, that is, how the text was formed over time. It's important to note that the historical critical method of interpretation is irrevocably linked to biblical studies, specifically in an attempt to naturalistically determine who the quote-unquote real authors of the Bible were, since any supernatural causes are usually automatically ignored by the historical critical scholar. When first established, the method was bound in naturalistic or evolutionary assumptions. As such, this critical method, sometimes referred to as higher criticism, has been rejected by many evangelical scholars for use upon the biblical text. Now, despite the great failures of the historical critical method upon the biblical text, these failures very often link to less than scholarly beliefs about the Bible. As a methodology of analysis for non-inerrant literature, the principles are sound. More properly focused, the historical critical method can be utilized to critique a text, which is to suspend one's own presuppositions about the text origin, transmission, and meaning, and then to assess the text based upon a close reading of the text itself, in addition to other relevant sources. This criticism then becomes the art and skill of making discriminatory evaluations of the text being studied. The historical aspect comes into play when the scholar requires that the meanings ascribed to the text were humanly possible within the original environment of the text, historically, socially, politically, and so forth. Basically, one may not assume to find nuclear fusion in a high-speed internet when reading Gilgamesh. Now, although not properly scienced, the criticisms used in the historical critical method act as analytical tools that exist as extensions of a rationalistic ideology, and therefore are quite scientific in process. A part of the scientific process of historical critical thought involves subdisciplines such as source criticism, redaction criticism, form criticism. But these disciplines move far beyond the scope of the study. In fact, within this study, the historical critical implications of the text have already been accomplished, and the reliance upon those implications is accepted when utilizing the published literature at question. While the historical critical method is used to critique aspects of the text, such as its origins, its reliability as a witness, and who or why someone changed the text over time, the historical grammatical method is only interested in the interpretation of the text. This is the approach utilized by many evangelical scholars today when analyzing the Christian scriptures. Here, the method refers to studying ancient literature in its original context by attempting to comprehend what the author intended the original audience to understand based upon grammar and syntax. In this sense, the historical aspect of the approach depends heavily upon the historical facts, while the grammatical aspect of the approach depends heavily upon the laws of grammar. The emphasis upon grammatical laws within the historical grammatical method allows the reader to pull the meaning of the text from within the text, rather than attempting to interpret the hidden, symbolic, or allegorical meaning of the text. This approach concerns itself with the literal interpretation first, and then from that literal interpretation, symbolic or allegorical meanings can be discovered if the text allows it. This is what is called exegesis as opposed to eisegesis. The latter meaning the reading of one's personal ideas into the text. As is usually the case, there must be a balance within these approaches when analyzing non-inerrant ancient Near Eastern texts. Discovering the origins of these documents, how they were redacted, and so forth, becomes necessary when dealing with historical texts that have multiple versions of the text, such as the Epic of Gilgamesh. With that said, many of the ancient Near Eastern texts come in the form of single documents, whether inscriptions, tablets, whatever, and therefore the historical critical approach is less necessary. For the scholar wishing to merely gloss the text in initial study, this problem is diminished by simply accepting the standard published texts. Deeper study is always possible, but little to no historical criticism is going to be attempted What's left is to understand how the historical grammatical approach can help the reader in an analysis of these texts. This is much less complicated, as the reader must begin by seeking only what the original author intended the original audience to understand. All other aspects of the interpretation must be founded in this. To aid in this discovery, a series of questions may provide some details that can then be utilized within the above mentioned models. And these questions are found in the instructions of each of your reading assignments. Now, these questions are as follows. What is the author's point or purpose? Okay, I mean, maybe you can find it, maybe you can't, but it's good to look for it. What is the argument that the author's making? What's the motivation for the piece? What problem does it address? What evidence or logic does he use to support his thesis? What is the context from which the author writes? Time, place, point of view, background, and experience. What assumptions does the author bring to writing this piece? What words or ideas are repeated? These will very often be clues to the author's points. What word choices seem significant? Does the author use any figures of speech to make his argument more persuasive? What's the structure of the text? How does the author build his argument through the work? How does the structure help make the author's point? What are the key passages in the work, and why are they important? What is surprising, odd, or troubling in the text? What contradictions or inconsistencies do you find in the text? What assumptions do you bring to the text? Is the text convincing to you? Why or why not? And finally, what questions do you have after reading it? What further study do you need to do? Well, our introduction to the course is now complete. From this point, we'll jump into the actual texts at study. As always, feel free to reach out to me with any comments or questions.